Share via email. Report story. By Uraraka My Socks Off. Chapter 1. Ochako laid gazing up at the stars. Outside in the courtyard of Heights Alliance, on the bluff up from the city with most of the campus lights off, she could almost make out the way the starlight twinkled as it made its way down to earth. The courtyard wasn't small, but Ochako wouldn't call it large either. Centered in the middle of the dorms, a couple short bushes and plants lined the quaint grassy area. During the day, the high walls of the dorms bordering the space helped block harsh sunlight and cold breezes, making it an ideal place for extracurricular quirk training. At night, the tall walls made the perfect frame to view the night sky. Or at least Ochako thought so. It had been over an hour since curfew. Everybody else in the dorms had retired to their rooms for the night, and the windows lining the space were dark, the hallway lights off. This wasn't the first time Ochako had evaded curfew to visit the courtyard. She had come out here many times on her own. Just to stargaze, breath, and relax after another demanding day at UA. It's important to find ways to decompress. That's what Yukio had advised Ochako and Suyu during their work-study at the Dragon Heroes Agency. Burnout was a real problem with young pros. Better for them to learn how to unwind and manage their energy now, when their biggest concerns were exams and mastering their quirks, instead of later when lives were on the line. Yukio, one of the top 10 heroes in Japan, relaxed by binging crime dramas. Najire Hado, another work-study at the Ryaku Agency and one of UA's big three, unwound by visiting flower gardens and tea shops. Sue would video chat with her siblings to decompress. For Ochako, all she needed was to look up at the night sky. Since she was young, Ochako had dreamed of using her quirk to fly through the stars. Every night she'd ask her parents to take her out stargazing. The show was always free. No additional costs, no breaking the bank. No matter how bad things got, no matter how many bills she saw piling up on the kitchen table, the stars always hung in the night sky, a bright future just out of reach. Then Ochako saw heroes in action, and she thought just maybe that bright future wasn't out of reach after all. When she saw the way everyone lit up around heroes, all the abundant smiling faces, Ochako began to dream. Heroes shined like stars. Being a hero was something she could strive for, something obtainable. That dazzling, brilliant radiance was something she could give to others. Ochako could save people. The world was full of dangerous things, disasters, villains, and who knew what else. There were plenty of reasons for people to be scared. Heroes were the stars that gave people hope. They kept people smiling. So, Ochako thought, she could become a hero. She'd shine like a star, save the day, bring smiles to people's faces. That was the dream. Ochako's dream was for her parents, too. Her mom and dad had fully endorsed their daughter. Growing up, they provided everything Ochako needed, from a quality education to hot meals and a loving home. They'd sacrificed and toiled and provided an unyielding pillar of support. But despite her parents' best efforts to hide it, Ochako knew finances were tough. Little Ochako saw the weariness on their faces. She saw the long hours and skipped meals. As she got older, she'd thumb through the bills and peek through the family finances. Ochako would run the numbers back and front and sideways, but no matter how she tried to sum it up, she just couldn't see how her parents managed to keep their construction business going while still providing for their daughter. She could only imagine the sacrifices they were making. Promoted stories. You'll also like The Hero Who Sings with a Smile 37.9K 362 high. Guys, this is my first story I write on Wattpad. I hope you like it. Free. Onishots 149K 3K. This is a collections of free X readers. Requests on this are now closed. Ohm Fluke a day 112K 8.2 kiloamperes. Collection of short Ohm Fluke over 365 days. Please check the second book for the rest of the day's update. Much needed love. Yandere Succubus Momo X Izu. 49.8K 766 after Wattpad had decided to delete this story out of nowhere. I and many reader were distraught. So I'm making a remake of the story from the ground up to compensate. Convicted Hearts 3380 like my other story but ILI longer. Return of Mokuden discontinued 3.5K 45 this. Story is officially up for adoption. If anyone is interested, message me or comment on the story. Mirko X Shy Male Reader 164K 1.1 key. Don't own MHA. I hope you enjoy the story I made. Her parents told her countless times not to fret over it. Follow your dreams, they'd say. Don't worry for our sakes. We just want you to be happy. Ochako knew they truly meant it. She had heard the old adage, money doesn't buy happiness. Maybe that was true. Maybe money didn't buy happiness. But happiness was certainly easier to find when the bills were paid and there was a pantry full of food. So she'd made up her mind. Ochako would become a hero, for her and her parents' sakes. She'd help people feel safe and make them smile. She'd help support her parents and give them the comfortable life they deserved. Ochako studied her butt off, fought to better her quirk, dared to reach as far as she could reach. And she'd done it. She'd gotten into UA. Ochako made it into the greatest hero school in the world. Suddenly the abstract dream Ochako had chased since she was a little girl transformed into a very real, very tangible goal. She could do it. She could actually do it. She would keep studying hard, work harder than ever, and learn all there was to being a pro. Ochako would become a hero her parents could be proud of. The same dazzling, brilliant radiance pro heroes had, she could gift that to others too. She'd already come so far. 25 minutes. The joyful declaration brought a smile to Ochako's face. She glanced over at Izuku laying down next to her. He was looking at the stopwatch on his phone with excitement dancing in his eyes. Both Ochako and Izuku were laying suspended a meter off the ground, held up by nothing more than the girl's own gravity-defying quirk. Both students were dressed in their blue, white, and red athletic uniforms. It had been nearly 2 weeks now since Ochako had asked Izuku for help training her quirk. It wasn't like she had been slacking. Quite the opposite. Her efforts during their summer training camp and work study at the Ryaku agency had gone a long way towards improving her quirk. Ochako felt far more capable than she had at the beginning of their first year. But she still felt set back by persistent nausea whenever she neared her limit. Limits were good, Aizawa-sensei had instructed. They kept you from going overboard. There were too many heroes who disregarded their own limits and ended up permanently injured, or worse. In many ways, Ochako was lucky to have such a clear indicator to keep from pushing too far. The problem was she needed her quirk to grow. And for her quirk to grow, she'd need to train herself to get over the nausea it produced. If there was anybody in Class 1A who could help Ochako push past her limits, it was the boy floating next to her. Deku's first year at UA was marked by rapid improvement. His passion was infectious, inspiring his classmates to greater and greater heights. He'd burst through his personal ceilings time and time again, and just kept on climbing. Granted, sometimes he burst through those ceilings a little too hard. Ochako lost count of how many times he'd needed healing by Recovery Girl, and he had ended up in the hospital more than once. Moreover, Izuku had shown a knack for creativity when it came to using quirks. He had notebook upon notebook of meticulous notes on each hero, their quirks, their strengths and weaknesses, everything. Deku adapted and innovated until the future he envisioned became a reality. Nothing stopped him. There wasn't a student in Class 1A who didn't want to be the greatest hero they could be, but so far as Ochako was concerned, Izuku was leading the pack. Surely together they could come up with countless new ways to use her quirk. Izuku had come through spectacularly. Almost as soon as Ochako had asked for his help, he begun brainstorming and came up with tons of ways to help advance her abilities. He'd even started a new notebook dedicated to the task. She could hardly believe he was so dedicated to helping her. Then again, was it really so surprising? The pair were no strangers to supporting each other. Izuku and Ochako had gotten along right from the start. Throughout their first year, Ochako and Izuku had fought, won, and cheered for each other. As their friendship grew, it didn't take Ochako long to see there was more to the boy. Izuku was kind. Deku was a dedicated fanboy with a gentle heart, which he wore fearlessly on his sleeve. He was nurturing. He was warm and compassionate. Izuku and Ochako had been there for each other since day one. He had her back, and she had his. They really were a great team. Ochako glanced over at the boy floating beside her. For a brief moment, she became lost in the starlight dancing in his eyes and the charming bounce of his hair in zero gravity. Izuku noticed her staring, and she shot her gaze back skyward. Need a break? Asked Izuku. Ochako's heart thumped a little as she replied, No, I'm good. Just something on my mind. She felt embarrassment rising in her cheeks. Get it together, Ochako, she chided herself. Getting into UA, Ochako had expected the school be difficult. From crushing academics to exhaustive hero training, the school lived up to its reputation. The one thing Ochako hadn't anticipated was a crush. She couldn't pinpoint exactly when her feelings for Izuku had shifted from friendship to something more. If Aoyama hadn't brought it up during their midterm exam, she'd probably still be in denial. At first, it had been nothing but admiration. Deku was the kind of hero she'd always wanted to be. No matter the trouble, no matter the obstacles, he always jumped in without a moment to spare. And he always found a way to win. He endured every hardship for others' sakes. A protector. It was no wonder Ochako had gravitated towards him. Ochako had rejected her feelings at first. She couldn't let herself get distracted. But her crush grew. So she focused on her classes. And her crush grew more. This wasn't good, she told herself. She hadn't gained acceptance into UA to be preoccupied with a boy's smile. She was here to become a hero. But no matter how she tried to reject it, eventually she had to admit what she felt. There was no denying it, she had caught feelings for Izuku. But what could she do? She was here for her dream. She was here for her parents. They had sacrificed so much to help her achieve her goal. The rest of it could wait. She pushed her feelings down, swept them under the rug, tucked them away. Keep moving forward. Ochako was going to be a hero her parents could be proud of. Izuku was going to be a top hero. They'd both keep running towards their goals. And yet every time Ochako dared pull back and check, her feelings were still there, undiminished as ever. Set them aside, she told herself. It'll get easier. It just has to get easier. How many times could she keep telling herself that? More and more, Ochako worried that she wouldn't be able to repress her feelings entirely. Even now, Ochako had to convince herself this was training. She was practicing endurance. Izuku was helping her increase the time she could maintain her quirk. That was all really. That Izuku and her were spending so much time together stargazing was just an unintended perk. At least that's what Ochako told herself, but she wasn't sure she believed it. No matter. She had to use her better judgment and put her fancies away for another time. Ochako continued to float on her back, and breathe, and look up. Such a deep, dark blue. Beautiful. A brief, brilliant line of light flashed across the sky. There's one, Ochako said, pointing upward. That's the second one tonight. Izuku replied. There was a rolling feeling in Ochako's stomach. As she'd practiced many times over the last few weeks, she took a breath, focused on the stars shining brightly overhead, and the nausea softly dissipated. The stargazing had been Izuku's idea the first night. Ochako had explained to him how she wanted to increase her endurance. She didn't want to rely on her hero costume. Her gear greatly helped negate the negative effects of her quirk, from stimulating pressure points to reducing headaches and nausea. But disaster could strike at any time. Ochako wanted to be ready, costume or not likewise. She couldn't rely on continuous breaks. A minute's rest for her could mean life or death for people trapped and scared. She'd used her quirk on Izuku, then on herself, and tried to keep both of them floating for as long as she could. Without her hero equipment to help, it was a mediocre display. Trying to use her quirk on herself was the kicker. First she'd feel the pressure in her ears, which would progress into a mild headache. Then dizziness would set in. After that, Ochako was lucky to avoid throwing up on her shoes. She tried to push past the nausea that first night only to lose focus and send Izuku and her crashing to the grass. They'd sat through the next day's classes suffering from bruised bottoms. After that, they'd been more careful. They tried a number of ways to take her mind off the nausea. Conversation had been impossible at first. Ochako had needed to focus entirely on concentrating. They'd tried reviewing homework, but math equations made Ochako's head spin even without her quirk. Finally, with the kind of eureka moment that preceded all of his best ideas, Izuku had suggested she just focus on the stars. It was simple enough. Ochako suspended them with her quirk. Then they'd laid back stargazing. No talking, no homework. She'd focused solely on the tiny pinpoints of light in the night sky. When she finally released her quirk, she'd been amazed. Ochako had held her quirk 5 minutes longer than she had the previous night. It worked. The next day, Izuku checked out a book on constellations and brought it to their nighttime training session. Together they'd pick out constellations. Then, Ochako would make them float and the pair would search the sky for the right stars. Suddenly it became easier. Ochako was improving. Before long they had no trouble finding two, then three, then five constellations, all before she would feel too dizzy to continue. Soon, on a night when the stars shone particularly bright, Ochako started telling Izuku about why she liked stargazing so much. She told him about stargazing as a child and about seeing heroes for the first time. She had been mid-sentence when the shock hit them both. She'd looked at him. He'd looked at her. They'd been chatting back and forth and Ochako hadn't even felt nauseous. From then on, night after starry night, Ochako would test the limits of her quirk's endurance and the pair would talk. They discussed school, of course. Classmates, teachers, the subjects they were struggling with. This inevitably slipped into talks about heroes. Izuku would dominate these conversations with stats, rankings, abilities, weaknesses, and ultimate moves, until Ochako wondered how his brain could possibly have any room left for anything else. But Ochako didn't mind in the slightest. If anything, she found his enthusiasm charming. In return, Ochako told him everything she knew about stars and galaxies and space. She didn't know much, but Izuku would listen with wide-eyed fascination all the same. Ochako told him about growing up in the Mie prefecture. Blankets of flowers, winter lights in the park, ancient temples, country trails leading to waterfalls. Growing up in Mustafa must have been a very different experience. Izuku's eyes would shine as she shared her stories. After a few nights of this, Ochako told him even more about her family's hardships. It was hard for her growing up, and it was still hard now. She reaffirmed her convictions. She'd help her parents live comfortably. It was the least they deserved. See those stars? Izuku said delightedly. Ochako glanced over. Izuku had his hand pointed skyward, lazily tracing a path with his fingers. If you connect them, they kind of look like Edgeshot. And that bunch over there. Ochako smiled. Her stomach rolled and she ignored it, looking up at the universe expanding above them. She followed the path Deku drew in the sky. Izuku seemed hesitant to discuss his childhood. Then on a night when the clouds covered most of the stars, in a voice so tiny Ochako had strained to hear, he told her about seeing the doctor after his 4th birthday. Izuku had spent his whole life wanting to be a hero. But his quirk hadn't appeared. Around 80% of the world's population had quirks, but it appeared Izuku wasn't one of them. He was labeled quirkless and bullied, picked on, and shunned. But then, Ochako had said, your quirk finally did appear. And it's super powerful. Izuku had given a nervous chuckle. It had appeared, and then he knew he had a chance. But it was more difficult than Ochako imagined. With his quirk, she'd expected Izuku would feel invincible. But that wasn't it at all. Sometimes, Izuku said, he felt more like porcelain. If he overdid it, his body would shatter, potentially beyond repair. There were some things even Recovery Girl couldn't mend. In contrast, Ochako's quirk had manifested when she was a child. Her powers felt like a natural extension of herself. She could barely imagine how Izuku felt having such a powerful quirk but with so little familiarity. And still he threw himself into danger to protect others. Whether that was recklessness or courage, Ochako couldn't decide. Eventually the conversations about school and heroes and their childhoods would trail off, leaving Ochako and Izuku to comfortably lay back and watch the stars. As they were doing now, it was a comfortable silence and a refreshing contrast to the demands put upon them as UA students. Ochako's stomach did a sudden backflip and rocked her out of reminiscing. No doubt about it, she was at her limit. She looked over at Izuku, frantically pointing at her wrist. Time. Izuku held up his phone. 30 minutes, 16 seconds. She pressed her fingers together and released her quirk. The pull of gravity returned. They rocked forward to land on their feet. Izuku was the only one who maintained his balance. Ochako had hardly touched down before her knees gave way and she fell back awkwardly on the grass. A chorus of dull, muffled thunks echoed through the courtyard as 10 ultra-compressed, high-density weights fell to the grass. The weights had been another Izuku idea. Ochako had swallowed her pride and accompanied him to the school's development studio. Together they had managed to convince Mei Hatsume to loan them a couple sets of the training weights, but not before she'd forced them to try out some of her newest babies. It had been worth it. The compressed weights had been a blessing for her training. Ochako had improved twice as fast with them than she would have without. Feeling ill and using her arms to brace herself, Ochako tried to drag herself up on wobbly legs. It was no good. She was too dizzy to stand, so she stayed seated on the grass. The world around her seemed to be spinning. The stars overhead were now streaking lines of light crisscrossing across her vision. Gradually, things slowed down. Ochako closed her eyes, and when she opened them the world was back to normal. The stars, the courtyard, The bushes, the weights, and Izuku kneeling next to her with a look of concern and an outstretched hand. Uraraka, he asked, are you okay? I might have pushed it a little too hard this time, came her woozy response. Despite her grin, Ochako knew she was exhausted. Then we should probably stop for the night, Izuku said while helping her to her feet. Now that she was standing, Ochako felt spry again. She recovered faster now too, but she'd strained herself hard. There wouldn't be much benefit to continuing longer tonight. Besides, she thought, we still have class tomorrow. The pair were cheerful as they busied themselves putting away the compressed weights. One by one, Ochako touched her fingers to each weight and Izuku bundled them up in a weatherproof cloth. They stashed the equipment out of sight under a bush before Ochako released her quirk. The weights settled with a dull thunk. That's the longest you've been able to keep us both floating, Izuku mentioned excitedly. His sincere amazement was a constant encouragement. And you were lifting all the compressed weights too. How much is that total? The strain of using your quirk on yourself, plus me, and 10 weights. He was already scribbling away in his notebook. He looked up suddenly with eyes shining like the stars overhead. Remember when we first started? Look how much you've improved. Did he know how much his eyes sparkled when he smiled like that? Her heart fluttered. It was just unfair. Despite her red cheeks, she composed her voice and managed a hurried, thanks, Deku. Ochako started her career at UA feeling like she was at the foot of a mountain. The climb to the top was daunting. She thought it would be lonely, but Class 1A had pulled through together. They'd grown closer, become friends, encouraged and supported each other. In particular, Ochako and Izuku had been there supporting each other since day one. Since before day one, she softly reminded herself, recalling their entrance exam. Back on that chill morning outside the exam building, Ochako hadn't given much thought to stopping the plain-looking, freckled boy from falling on his face. Back then, she hadn't known him and he hadn't known her. Ochako couldn't have predicted how much of an impact Izuku Midoriya would come to make in her life. His example had shown her how much was really possible. The boy's drive to become the greatest hero was infectious. In turn, Ochako worked hard to put one foot in front of the other, lift her chin a little higher, and trust herself. Ochako would burst past her own ceilings and keep climbing until she reached the stars. Chapter 2. Izuku took a seat at the lunch table next to Iida. His shoulders slumped. Staring down into his pork cutlet bowl, he let out the massive yawn he'd been repressing all morning. Midoriya, have you not been sleeping well? Todoroki took the seat across from Izuku. To the untrained eye, his expression appeared neutral, but Izuku could make out the subtle tells of concern on Todoroki's face. Iida spun to regard Izuku so quickly he almost knocked both their trays off the table. A proper sleep schedule is imperative to our continued development as students. Izuku scooted himself a couple inches over as Iida's exaggerated hand motions threatened to push him off his seat. No, no, it's nothing like that. I've been sleeping fine. Izuku's voice shrunk as he tried to explain. I was up late last night, studying. Todoroki regarded him curiously, a question floating unasked behind his fixed gaze. Studying. Izuku nodded. Uraraka and him had agreed that they shouldn't let their classmates know about their extra training at night. Particularly Iida. Especially Iida. Their training sessions were after curfew. Izuku could only image how severely their friend would short-circuit if he found out they were willingly breaking a UA rule. Ah, Ida's fingertips jammed into Izuku's cheek as he pushed a knife-like hand towards his friend. I also have trouble finding the balance between rest and our academics. Both are key for our continued success. I would be happy to recommend some proven time management techniques. I am also available to help with tutoring, should you need my assistance. Hands held up towards Iida, Izuku gently tried to curb his friend's enthusiasm. It's okay, Iida, I'll be fine. This is too much, really. Two trays slammed down on the lunch table as the boys were joined by Kirishima and Kaminari, lured over by the energetic conversation. Midoriya has been staying up late studying, Todoroki updated the newcomers. As Kaminari began to air his own frustrations with their coursework, Izuku saw his phone light up next to his tray. A new message, from Uraraka. Too tired to train tonight. Izuku scanned the cafeteria. Uraraka was sitting at a table across the way with the other girls from Class 1A. There was no mistaking the look of concern on her face. Shoot, he thought, she must have seen me yawn. Reflexively, Izuku found himself responding with a reassuring grin. The last thing he wanted was Uraraka thinking his tiredness was her fault. The truth was, the extra hour or two of lost sleep had started to take its toll. It wasn't as if Uraraka and Izuku met up every night, but with everything else they had on their plates, coursework, hero training, work studies, the missed sleep was starting to add up. But Izuku had come to really look forward to helping Uraraka train her quirk, and the time they spent together under the stars. He couldn't let her know he was tired. He picked up his phone and tapped briskly at the screen. Not at all. Let's meet at the same time tonight. Across the cafeteria, Izuku saw Uraraka read the message. When she looked back at him, there was a small curl to her lips, but a reflection of worry was still present in her eyes. Then he saw Mina lean across the table and say something. Izuku couldn't make out what was said, but Uraraka recoiled before frantically waving her hands at their pink classmate. Oi, Midoriya. Distracted. Huh. Kirishima's voice brought Izuku's attention back to his own table. Four pairs of eyes stared at him. Izuku realized he'd missed their entire conversation. Before Izuku could begin to apologize, Kaminari interjected, "Oh ho. Texting a girl, maybe. You got a crush, Midoriya." Crush. The word took a second to hit Izuku. When it did, he nearly fell backwards off his seat. Both Iida and Kirishima gave surprised gasps and leaned in towards him. Izuku scrambled to recover, flailing and fidgeting and stammering, then putting his hand to his mouth. He suddenly felt hot. Was he sweating? No. He began, far too quickly. It's not like that. It's about schoolwork. Hero training. Like Iida said, we have a responsibility to devote ourselves fully to our studies and continue to progress towards being heroes. We cannot let distract us from. The rest of the table watched as Izuku quickly descended into Midoriya mumblings, words now coming out too fast and too quietly for them to make any sense of what Izuku was saying. Iida and Todoroki looked at each other straight-faced, as if to say, there he goes. Midoriya is right, Kirishima broke in. We have so much to focus on right now, we hardly have enough downtime to rest. We don't have time to be crushing on anybody. Kaminari and Iida both jumped in to respond. Izuku wasn't listening anymore. His thoughts circled back to the last couple weeks. Watching the stars with Uraraka. A crush. No, he just wanted to help her become the incredible hero she wanted to be. Wait. No, Izuku corrected himself, that's not right. Uraraka already was an incredible hero. She was strong and kind, brave and empathetic, determined and unwavering. She was one of his closest friends. She had always been there, supporting and encouraging him. Izuku would do whatever he could to support her too. A crush. No, it was just that sometimes, near her, thinking became a little difficult. That was all. Not a crush. There was no time for crushes. Unbidden, his thoughts shifted to memories of brown eyes soaking in starlight. He scrambled to push the thoughts away. No, 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 no. Izuku was here to become the greatest hero. He was All Might's protege, inheritor of One for All. He'd worked so hard to get into UA. Izuku couldn't overthink things. He couldn't let these feelings. Wait, feelings. What feelings? There are no feelings, his mind thought desperately. Uraraka was just his friend. He felt comfortable with her. It didn't matter if he made himself look like an idiot with her. In fact, there were some things he could say to Uraraka that he wouldn't admit to anybody else. Certainly not a crush. It was just, when he was around her, all the stress unwound, all the tightness he didn't even feel until it left. No, not a crush. He just liked being around her. He liked, oh, Izuku thought. Oh no, his brain and heart began fighting for his attention in a stalemated game of tug of war. Haven't you noticed? His heart yanked, your heart beating faster around her. Izuku's mind tried to reason back. Well, yes, but that's just. And doesn't your stomach flutter every time she looks at you? Encouraged his heart. His mind countered. That's just because. Just as Izuku's mind seemed to gain the upper hand. Focus on school. Focus on training. One for all. His heart would dig in and tug all the harder. Remember the warmth in her smile. Remember how she raises you up. The inward war for his attention continued, and Izuku's mind raced until he could barely follow his own thoughts, with no hope of slowing down. Across the table, Todoroki regarded his green-haired classmate calmly. He paid no mind to the loud debate happening between Iida, Kaminari, and Kirishima. The boy turned his head and looked towards the table where the girls were sitting. Mina displayed a triumphant grin. She was shouting something Todoroki couldn't quite make out. Hagakure pumped her invisible gloved hands in the air. Jiro and Yaoyorozu looked on with empathetic smiles. Uraraka had her hands to her cheeks, and was beginning to float out of her seat. Sue, calm and composed as ever, had a hand on the girl's shoulder to keep her from drifting off. Uraraka was blushing fiercely. Todoroki turned back and saw a similar scarlet slowly spreading across Midoriya's furrowed face. Todoroki blinked. He took a bite of his food, chewing slowly. Ochako watched Izuku sitting with his legs crossed, head down in one of his notebooks while softly floating a few meters off the ground. The pair were out in the courtyard of Heights Alliance. Someone had left a light on in the common room, casting a fragile afterglow across the space. Ochako would have been frustrated by this. The light would make stargazing difficult, but there were clouds dotting the sky. Only a few tiny pockets of stars showed through. The air felt warm. If Izuku was distracted by the way he whimsically rotated through the air, he didn't show it. His emerald eyes were laser-focused as he scribbled away. Sometimes he frowned, combing fingers through dark hair. No amount of brushing could make it ruly. He mumbled something about Gran Torino and increased mobility. Ochako tried to peer past his scribbling hand at the page. What is he brainstorming? For those unfamiliar with him, Izuku's rambling note-taking could come across as eccentric. Watching quirks at work, he'd pick up on any cue and his mind would cut loose with an astonishing torrent of creativity and improvisation. Deaf to the rest of the world, his hand moved like a machine in his notebook. He seemed to breathe in through his nose while maintaining an endless flow of mumbled words out of his mouth. Once, Ochako saw Izuku blow through 5 pages of notes in less than a minute. She had actually come to find it kind of endearing. He was passionate, and she admired the way he devoted himself so completely. Realizing she was grinning idiotically, Ochako wiped it away. She really had to keep a rein on herself. Ochako tucked her fancies aside and turned back to the task at hand. Floating in front of her were 5 compressed weights. She pressed her fingertips together, concentrating on just one. The weight fell gently to the grass below, the other 4 staying suspended in zero gravity. Ochako couldn't help being prideful. The trick was far more difficult than it appeared. It was a fine art, isolating her quirk to release a single object without dropping the rest. But Ochako was heading towards a future of natural disasters, fighting villains, and saving lives. The versatility would prove vital. All the more reason for her to practice. Focus, she thought while pressing her finger pads together. Their evening training sessions usually began this way. Ochako would warm up with the weights, releasing them one by one, while Izuku would pore over his notes, brainstorming different applications of her quirk. As the last ultra-compressed weight settled to the grass, Ochako glanced back at the boy. Izuku was still lost in thought. His mumbling had slowed, and he was rubbing his chin pensively. He'd left his notebook and pencil floating beside him. With a wicked spark, Ochako pressed her fingerpads together. Izuku absent-mindedly reached towards his notes but grasped empty air as the book and pencil dropped harmlessly to the grass below. Izuku, alarmed, stretched out his hand instinctively, straining to reach his notebook on the ground before realizing his efforts had absolutely no effect on his momentum. He shot a confused look at Ochako and was met with a mischievous smirk. Ochako released him, and Izuku touched down with a wobbly look of embarrassment. She leaned towards him, sweetly tilting her head. She said, "Sounds like you had some good ideas, Deku." Izuku seemed unable to meet her eye as he began stammering and flipping through his notes. Ochako studied him. Odd. Deku was frazzled tonight. Come to think of it, he'd seemed off all afternoon, even during their hero courses. Did something happen? Once Izuku calmed down, he elaborated. I was thinking of the ways your quirk helps with mobility. He held up his notebook so she could see. At first, I thought your quirk worked best as a support class, combined with other quirks. But that's not necessarily true. See. Ochako just stared at the boy. Izuku's eyes were like green fire. Your quirk is really powerful, especially now that you can use it on yourself for so long. If you just got in close, you'd be really effective one-on-one, combining your quirk with your gunhead martial arts. Most opponents would probably take that into account, though. They'll try to keep you at a distance or limit a direct approach. She nodded, like when she faced Bakugo in the sports festival. Despite her desperate strategy, she hadn't had much choice but to face him head-on. She always needed to get in close. In an open space, you're pretty limited, but in an environment like this, you have a lot of options. Izuku gestured to the walls lining the courtyard. He told Ochako about his training with Gran Torino. The old hero rarely approached directly, instead using his unfathomable speed to ricochet across environments to mix up his opponents. Izuku pointed to one wall of the courtyard and drew a zigzag pattern through the air. Ochako's gaze followed the path his finger traced. If you made yourself weightless, you'd have all kinds of different ways to approach in a place like this. She beamed. Leave it to Deku. That's a great idea. Ochako walked to the edge of the courtyard. She was determined, but decided to take it slowly. She'd start with one side of the courtyard to the other. Placing a hand on the wall, she tapped the fingers of the other against her thigh. Weightlessness washed over her. The feeling of nausea was non-existent. Ochako delicately raised herself up against the wall, planting both her feet flat on the smooth surface. She was no stranger to reorienting herself in zero gravity, but it was still odd having the world flipped round. Looking across to the opposite wall, Ochako double-checked her trajectory, making sure she'd land away from any windows. The last thing they needed was to shatter any glass. With a purposeful twist of her lips, Ochako pushed off. She drifted gingerly across the courtyard. Okay, Ochako thought, maybe she'd been too careful. The slow speed she was traveling was comical. Once she'd nearly reached the oncoming wall, she reached her arms overhead to cushion her landing. Ochako spun. In one fluid motion, she swung her legs underneath her and pushed off again the way she'd come. A little faster this time. As she'd done before, she caught herself and swung her feet around, planting them against the wall. That went well, she thought, while looking over to Izuku. How'd that look? His pure delight was unmistakable. Really good. She braced herself and pushed off again. Ochako couldn't hope to outmuscle quirks like Kirishima's hardening or Sato's sugar rush. She'd have to beat them with superior technique and application of her quirk. Maneuvers like this would be a great start. Ochako threw herself into it, repeating the movement a few more times, and then a few more after that. Ochako thought back to the beginning of their first year. Iida had organized a group run for Class 1A. They'd ran for barely 10 minutes and Ochako had been drenched with sweat and dying for air. Afterwards, she'd pulled Iida aside. She wanted to know how he did it. It wasn't just that the class representative was so fast. Even without his quirk it was hard to keep up with him. It's just that Iida seemed so light on his feet, as though he willed himself forward by mind power instead of muscle. She'd wanted to learn to run like that. Of course, Uraraka, the class representative, was always happy to instruct. Lesson 1. Get right behind me and do as I do. The two had set off together, Ochako following along right behind him. Iida started by jogging, more slowly than before. Ochako had tried to copy everything he did. Her arms floated up her sides until her hands were rib-high. Her stride chopped down to little pitty-pattering steps. Her back straightened so much she almost heard the vertebrae creaking. Iida jogged ahead of her, looking like he was born to pound pavement. Are you keeping up, Uraraka? Yes, she'd gasped. It felt odd at first, but she had to admit it was easier. Right. Lesson 2. Iida had called over his shoulder. This is the Iida family secret. You must think easy, light, smooth, and then fast. First, make it look easy. Next, work on staying light. When you have that down, make it smooth. Once you have those three down, you'll be fast. Iida had been right. Ochako was far more comfortable running now, and had even improved on her best times. So that's exactly the logic she applied now. First, she decided to bounce from wall to wall until it felt easy, because if she never got any faster, at least she'd have that. Soon enough Ochako found that it was actually very, very easy for her. She'd been playing with gravity practically her whole life. It felt as natural as breathing. After she felt confident it was easy, she worked on staying light. She landed like a cat, barely bracing against the wall before her legs were already springing her away. After a couple minutes, it felt fluid. Okay, she thought, I have easy and light down. Now Ochako wanted to make it smooth. How effortlessly could she flow from catching herself to shooting off again? Ochako found tricks for better leverage, propulsion, and timing. She didn't fight her momentum, she took what it gave her. Before long she was finding ways to position her feet so she'd pop away from the wall like a spring-loaded piston. That's better. It was time to work on speed. But to Ochako's surprise, it was just like Iida had said. She already was fast. She nimbly launched off a wall upside down and reached the opposite end of the courtyard in just a second. With everything else, speed came naturally now, so Ochako decided to experiment. She played with altering her trajectory midair. She sped across the courtyard, releasing her quirk, and dropped down again. She re-engaged her quirk, suddenly lighter than a feather, and kept going. Ochako's stomach was doing cartwheels, but she trained on. In fact, she felt so easy, light, smooth, and fast that she never wanted to stop. Push, zoom, release, drop, zero gravity, pivot, land, push, roll, tuck, land, push. Ochako had never moved through zero gravity like this. She couldn't help laughing. She felt like an astronaut. Ochako knew she had to be fast and creative if she was going to make any use of this technique. Faster, faster, faster. She just had to get faster. Even now, her brain was warning her this was too fast, that this was crash and burn speed. If she got reckless or sloppy, it could be hazardous. And still she dared to keep going, rebounding off the walls, limber and spry. Growing up, there were times Ochako felt her quirk was a bit dull. It lacked the flash of present mic, the power of endeavor, or the versatility of 13. If nothing else, she thought she could help clear debris from disaster areas. Now look at me. She could maintain her quirk longer than she'd imagined and was using it in unexpected ways. Nausea subsided as Ochako relaxed into the rhythm of the exercise. Release. She landed back on the grass, breathing heavily. Her shoulders ached. Her legs felt heavy. She looked up. Clouds almost completely covered the sky now. She could barely make out any stars. Was it just her, or was it warmer? Near the edge of the grass, Izuku was writing in his notebook again. His normal fanboyish, analytical expression was replaced with thoughtful self-reflection. He put his pencil down and shut the notebook. Izuku fixed Ochako with such an intent look in his emerald eyes, she thought her heart would leap out of her chest. Uraraka, I have an idea, but I need your help. She looked at him with shining eyes and words evaporated from Izuku's mouth like water in a desert. He'd always had trouble talking to girls. It wasn't that he didn't want to, just that he hadn't gotten many chances before starting classes at UA. Luckily, hero training had forced Izuku to adapt. It had taken a little while, but now he could work alongside the girls in Class 1A with barely a stutter. They were classmates, comrades, and even friends. Like Uraraka, the first girl he had befriended. The friend who had constantly offered him up encouragement. The person he could always turn to for support. He didn't think he could have gotten this far without her. And here she was, giving him a smile, and he was losing words and forgetting how to speak. Izuku thought he had moved past this. Ever since lunch earlier that day, Izuku's mind had been spinning with the conclusion that he did feel something for Uraraka. He still wasn't sure if it was a crush. He'd never had a crush before. He'd been flustered before, sure. But this seemed to run deeper. Classes, training, heroes, these were where Izuku focused his time. These feelings towards Uraraka were foreign. They'd flown under his notice entirely and he was just now beginning to understand them. How long had they been there? What did they mean? What should he do? He'd become distracted. He'd thought and thought, for most of the rest of the day, and all that came of it was more confusion and more discontent. Now he couldn't look at her without his brain freezing up and his heart thumping in his ears. She reduced him back into a ball of nerves. But Izuku had faced down full-fledged villains and more during his first year. He could push down these feelings. At least until he had a chance to sort them out. Get it together, Izuku thought. I've never been able to maneuver well in midair, he finally clarified. Uraraka hadn't seemed to notice his fumbling. But I think with your quirk, I might have a way. She nodded at him to keep going. Just tell me when you need me. Uraraka's grin said she meant it, but then, Uraraka always said what she meant. Izuku focused. Crackling energy flowed along his bones as one for all surged through his muscles. It seemed to come so effortlessly to him now. Just 5%, Izuku focused. 5%. In a moment, the pulsing power comfortably stabilized. Izuku looked at Uraraka with a wobbly smile. All right, Uraraka, can you use your quirk on me? She seemed hesitant as she stepped towards him. The air around Izuku snapped with static from his quirk. It's okay, I promise. Uraraka reached out and tapped her fingers against his shoulder. Immediately he felt the feeling of weightlessness. He was untethered to the earth. It surprised him how familiar the feeling was, after the last 2 weeks. With his right hand, Izuku curled his middle finger under his thumb. He braced his forearm with his left hand and aimed down, directly between his feet. This idea already seemed risky. Izuku wasn't sure how powerful an effect this would be. Maybe if he hadn't been so flustered today, he would have taken the time to draw up some equations or hazard some hypothesizes. He flexed his fingers. In a moment of hesitation, he gave Uraraka a look. Better safe than sorry. You, might want to step back a bit. Just in case. Uraraka took a couple steps back. Her eyes flashed with reassurance. He didn't need to hear her voice to understand the message. She helped coax him along just by being there. Go for it, Deku. Izuku focused one for all into his finger. Just like my Smash Air Force. He concentrated, bringing the power of one for all up to 15%, just for an instant. Snap. He sped upward. The courtyard and walls of Heights Alliance instantly rushed past. Izuku thought he briefly saw Uraraka call out to him. If she had, her voice was quickly swallowed up in the air racing past his ears. Everything around Izuku was a blur. The wind tore at his hair and dragged at his clothes until he thought his shoes would pop off his feet. Without gravity to contend with, he was going far, far faster than he'd anticipated. Up and up, until what had been gray-green blurs began to solidify into distant forested hills. Blue-gray blurs soon materialized as the sky, and the gray-yellow blurs became the city of Mustafu with thousands of glittering lights. The rushing continued. As Izuku began to recover and gather his bearings, he was hit with the abrupt realization that there was nothing to slow him down. At this rate, he'd keep ascending until he reached the stratosphere. Shoot, he thought madly, I have to stop. Trying to raise his hand overhead was a monumental task. Violent wind bucked his arm and it was impossible to steady himself. It felt like being caught in a current. He couldn't see, couldn't hear, could barely breathe. Still, Izuku had to try. When he thought he got his arm pointing directly overhead, Izuku channeled one for all into his fingers, not nearly as much power as before, as that had proved disastrous, and braced himself. Snap! More blurs and more rushing wind. The shift in momentum tore at Izuku, dragging his face backward until he thought his mouth would stretch behind his ears. Shoot! It had worked though. He was no longer speeding upward, but he was no closer to the ground or the campus now. He couldn't even tell where UA was below him. Bracing his arm in front of him, Izuku desperately tried to work out the different angles, his eyes frantically searching for the school campus on the earth below. Snap! The shift threatened to bowl him tumbling over. Shoot, shoot, shoot. How had Uraraka made zero gravity look so easy, bouncing around the courtyard? He had a glimpse of what he hoped was the UA campus zooming by below him. Snap. Blurs. He was zooming towards the far hills again. Below him, the tiny rectangles that could only be the UA campus sat peacefully. Izuku saw that much before his own momentum caused him to stumble and begin cartwheeling through the sky. Damn it, Izuku wailed. How did Kachan do it with his explosion quirk? Snap, snap. This time Izuku fired in rapid succession. Closer. He'd managed to slow himself and was somehow rushing back over where he hoped the dorms would be. He drifted off again with his own momentum and another snap shot him along a better trajectory. Snap. Back the way he'd come. Snap. He had to be careful. Snap. He had to line it up just right. Snap. If he missed the courtyard and landed outside on the lawn. Snap. It could trigger the campus alarms. Snap. Snap. He was getting the hang of it now. Snap. He was directly over their dorm, he was sure. Here we go, Izuku cried, doubtfully. This time he spun himself towards the sky, extending both hands, one in front of him to cancel his momentum and the other pointed towards the stars to send him straight back to the ground. And back to the courtyard, he hoped. Izuku's muscles strained as he aimed carefully and deliberately. Snap. His whole body reverberated as Izuku was redirected towards the earth. He shook himself from his daze just in time to see the perfectly manicured lawns of UA speeding towards him. He couldn't believe it. He'd got it right. Izuku was flying straight down towards the center of their dorm, back to the courtyard. The small square target was quickly growing larger. The roofs of Heights Alliance reached up as if to ensnare him. Still too fast. Izuku braced himself, pointing his hand directly down. His finger strained against thumb. How much power would it take to keep from slamming into the ground? There was no time to figure it out. At the last moment, he saw Uraraka. Her fingers were nearly pressed together. Fiery determination blazed in her eyes as she watched his descent. Izuku almost grinned. Of course, he thought. He wasn't in this alone. Uraraka maintained her quirk throughout it all. She has my back. The realization filled him with newfound confidence. Just as the rooftops enveloped him, Izuku felt his equilibrium shift. Uraraka had released her quirk. Izuku had gravity again. The ground loomed just a few meters away. Snap. Gravity kept Izuku from shooting back into the sky. Instead, he found himself bouncing clumsily upward a couple meters. He fumbled, flipped over himself, and landed solidly on the grass with feet and hands spread, barely keeping his balance. Izuku stayed that way, frozen. Uraraka made as if to run to him and see if he was okay, but stopped short. He eyed her nervously. Deku. In a heartbeat, he saw Uraraka's eyes flash from worry to relief, then from relief to an angry glint, and Izuku knew he was in real trouble. That was reckless. What were you thinking? I'm sorry. I'm still perfecting that technique. I didn't think it'd be so powerful. From the girl's stance and furrowed brows, Izuku knew his apology didn't cut it, and she continued accusingly. You could have been hurt. Badly. You disappeared so fast, I couldn't even see how far up you went. Izuku couldn't help his gaze turning skyward. Dark clouds drifted across the sky. He had to squint just to see the top of the dorm's roof. In his mind's eye, he imagined himself suddenly shooting up, quickly disappearing into the night sky without a trace. He imagined Uraraka, back in the courtyard sick with worry, not sure if she should release her quirk or maintain it. She was right. Izuku had been reckless, almost nonchalant about the risks. He'd gone and rushed ahead too fast, and left Uraraka behind to stew in concern. I'm sorry, he said again. This time he really meant it. I took it too fast. I was thinking of how All Might used to move through the air, almost like he was flying. But I didn't think it through. If you were trying to fly, you must have forgotten how, Uraraka replied doubtfully, but she seemed to relax. Her voice was much sweeter when she said, "We'll get there, Deku. We need to improve, and there's some risk involved. But if something had happened to you because of my quirk." She trailed off, and the silence lingered heavily. "I'll be more careful, Uraraka." Izuku had leagues to go before he was as great as All Might had been. The pros were still in a class of their own. But that didn't mean it was bad to take it slow sometimes. Some things couldn't be rushed. I promise. Uraraka seemed to hear the sincerity in his voice. The smile she gave him was filled with relief. "Good. Just warn me next time you want to do something like that." Then Izuku said he wanted to try it again, and he thought Uraraka might slap him. "I meant with less power. And down here, I'll bounce around the courtyard like you did earlier." Uraraka's eyes seemed to have steam behind them. She wasn't convinced. She made Izuku walk through it with her, explain exactly how he planned to proceed. He explained how he regulated the power of his quirk. He'd go slowly this time. With a note of resignation, Uraraka tapped her fingers against his shoulder, a bit harder than Izuku thought was necessary, and weightlessness washed over him. Izuku didn't have to look back at the girl to feel the unspoken expectation she was directing his way. If Izuku even so much as thought of taking it too fast again, she'd release her quirk and send him stumbling back to the ground, bruises and all. "Okay, how about I start with no power?" Izuku took Uraraka's nod of approval as a good sign. "No power. No one for all. No gravity." He raised his arm and snapped his fingers. Nothing happened. That was good. He hadn't expected anything to happen, so it was exactly in line with his expectations. Now 1%. One for all surged through him naturally. He forced it down into a tiny, minuscule spark of power and snapped his fingers. Izuku thought he felt something this time, but it could have easily been his imagination. "Notice anything?" Uraraka shook her head. "It didn't look like you moved at all." "Right, 2%. It was a small difference." Izuku found regulating and maintaining a lower percentage of one for all took just as much self-restraint as it did control. This was turning out to be a very helpful exercise. He adjusted the power as carefully as tuning a guitar string. Snap. Izuku felt his upper body delicately pitch backward, but he still stayed in place. That was certainly progress. 3%. Snap. Now he was drifting backwards, as nonchalant as a dandelion seed caught in a breeze, his feet softly scraping against the grass. 4%. Snap. Baby steps, but Izuku knew he was catching on without gravity. It didn't take much power at all. He spun his arm to his side. Snap. Now to go up. Snap. Back down. Snap. Back and forth, up and down. Izuku adjusted and maneuvered in micro increments. As he bumped it up to 5%, Izuku saw Uraraka softly floating across the courtyard. She must have been satisfied with his cautious approach and decided to continue her own training. Bouncing along from wall to wall, she made it look as effortless as a dolphin in water. And she really was faster now, Izuku realized. Stage by stage, Izuku sped up too. Uraraka and him were moving at much the same speed now. They were careful to avoid bumping into each other, but not for lack of close calls. Izuku twice had to perform some emergency redirections to avoid landing on any windows. He paused while bracing against a wall. Uraraka moved in a complex pattern around the space, landing and then transitioning from dramatic angles to shoot off again in a new direction. Fluid, natural, almost graceful. She'd gotten it down fast. No, Izuku thought, it was more than that. She was self-inventing. Each rebound off the wall was a tiny breakthrough, and they were all adding up to a style all her own. Izuku realized he was staring. He couldn't help it. Uraraka looked natural, like she was born to float through the air, her hair softly bouncing in zero gravity. Her quirk was simply a genuine extension of herself. Izuku didn't think he'd ever look like that when using one for all. At least, not yet. Watching her inspired Izuku. Night Eye had once said his movements were like a lesser Gran Torino. Maybe, Izuku pondered, if he learned to rebound off walls with the fluidity Uraraka was displaying, he could increase his speed. He had to take some notes. Shooting downward, Izuku aimed to scoop up his notebook off the ground. Just before the journal was in arm's reach, Uraraka whizzed by and snatched it up. She challenged him with a playful "come and get me" grin, which Izuku returned with a competitive smile of his own, and they were off. The pair raced through the air of the courtyard, Uraraka managing to stay one step ahead of Izuku. He sped up and she'd speed up, an endless game of cat and mouse. Haha, I've stolen the ultimate database of hero knowledge. You'll never catch me, hero. Izuku couldn't help laughing. Mouse. Haha, I've stolen the ultimate database of hero knowledge. You'll never catch me, hero. Izuku couldn't help laughing. So that's the way it is, huh? Uraraka hadn't seen him face off against Gran Torino or Night Eye. Izuku could go much faster than this. And that's exactly what he did. Channeling more of one for all through him, Izuku braced himself, aimed careful, and snap, snap, snap. Almost instantly, Izuku became a streak of green lightning ricocheting across the courtyard. Uraraka could only gasp. She spun and barely managed to keep him from reaching the notebook. Stumbling, she braced against a wall and kicked off across the longest length of the courtyard. There. Now he had her. Quickly redirecting himself with his smash air force, Izuku landed on the wall opposite Uraraka and shot off to intercept her path, head on. She couldn't dodge him now. But Uraraka didn't show a hint of surprise. With amused confidence, she pressed her fingers together and dropped. She'd cancelled her quirk on herself. She'd done it so smoothly he didn't have a chance to react. Uraraka neatly plunged underneath him while Izuku zoomed overhead, barely managing to keep from splattering into the oncoming wall. Game over. I give up. He croaked. Izuku regained his bearings and watched Uraraka make herself float again just before reaching the ground. She pushed off the grass, flew at an angle, grabbed the edge of the rooftop 4 stories up, and cautiously made her way along the tiles to sit down at the peak. Izuku followed. After stumbling his way up the tiles to join her, Uraraka pressed her fingers together, and the pair sat exhausted and grateful for the return of gravity. With a teasing look that said, "Maybe next time," Uraraka handed Izuku back his notebook. He accepted it with a resigned laugh. The pair looked out over the campus into the distance. It would have been a fantastic perch to stargaze, if it wasn't for the clouds. Lights radiated out from the city in the distance. Among the urban epicenter, there would still be a bustle of activity, even this late at night. But not here. On this rooftop, nestled in the sleeping UA campus, there was just Uraraka and Izuku. "Thanks, Deku." There was a quiet sincerity in Uraraka's voice that compelled Izuku to look at her. A lazy night breeze tossed the girl's bangs as she looked out over the trees and lights and beyond. "Before coming to UA, I never imagined I'd be able to take my quirk this far. Now I'm realizing there's so much more I can do. You're really helping me out." Oh, of course, came his sheepish reply. But so much of it is you. Your quirk is really amazing, and look how long you can maintain it now, and it didn't even phase you having us both zooming around the courtyard. You picked it up so fast, I could barely keep up. Brown eyes met Izuku's as Uraraka giggled at him. I don't know if that's entirely true, but thank you. Thoughts of crushes and feelings stampeded through Izuku's mind. There was a frantic trembling in his chest. He turned away before he could embarrass himself more. That really was amazing, Uraraka continued, laying a finger on one round cheek. When you shot up into the air, I mean. And dangerous. You were right, he added. It was dangerous. If Izawa found out, he'd expel you. But still, your quirk is so powerful. And then at the end there, I thought you really had me for a second. You were really moving. Uraraka's tone quickly took on her normal enthusiasm. You've never told me about when your quirk first appeared. What was it like? You must have been so excited. Izuku fumbled and mumbled with his words. Uraraka must have felt the apprehension radiating off him because she seemed to regret asking. Izuku reassured himself. Uraraka couldn't have realized his hesitation stemmed from the nature of his quirk. One for all, an incredible power and an incredible secret to keep. All Might had always been so skilled at deflecting questions like these. Izuku must have watched his idol in hundreds of interviews sidestep similar questions with laughter, a smile, and his commanding presence. This was not something Izuku had practiced, though, and certainly not a question he was ready to answer. Deku. Uraraka looked at him with brown eyes, and it seemed he saw nothing else. Are you okay? Yes, Uraraka. It's fine. It's just. You don't have to answer if you don't want to. She was giving him such a considerate smile. Uraraka looked light-hearted and carefree, her eyes twinkling, her hair bobbing in the night breeze, and Izuku had to look away to hide the flush on his cheeks. Izuku knew he couldn't tell Uraraka about One for All. He trusted her, and he knew he could rely on her to keep the secret. But the truth about his quirk, everything he had to protect, and all he had to lose, was known to only a few. He'd sworn to All Might to tell no one, and Izuku had already broken that promise by telling Bakugo. And as Kachan had pointed out, it was a dangerous secret for anyone to know. If the wrong people found out about the existence of One for All, the lives of Izuku's friends and family would all be at risk. No, Izuku couldn't tell Uraraka about One for All. But maybe he could tell her something. Izuku tried to sit up straight and took a single, deep breath. His nerves calmed as he breathed out. He turned to meet Uraraka's eyes. I trust you, he tried to impart with his gaze. I know I can trust you. Please keep this between us. From the earnest look he got in response, Uraraka understood. The first time I ever used my quirk, he began, was in our entrance exam. It took a moment for that to sink in. Before Uraraka clarified, the entrance exam, you mean the giant robot? He nodded. That was the first time you used your quirk. Ever. He nodded again. I still remember that moment. It was like a switch was flipped. I didn't think, I just reacted. Reacted. With that massive robot approaching, his mind had screamed for him to run and focus on passing the exam. Upon seeing Uraraka trapped under the rubble in the robot's path, his heart had taken over. His mind had begged for flight. His heart had screamed to fight. He'd shot into the air, smashing the zero-point robot in a single arm-shattering punch. Until then, I was just a kid who grew up wanting to be a hero. In that moment, I finally was one. I could have done without the broken bones though. Uraraka gave him a pitying smile. It was pretty reckless. I got lucky though. You were there to catch me. Yeah. She trailed off, looking into the distance. I guess I was. They sat in silence for a moment. A warm breeze disturbed the night air. Uraraka reflected. You're always jumping in. I can't help it. I know what it's like to be small and weak, so when I see. Hang on. Are you saying you had to save me in the entrance exam because I'm small and weak? What? And no. That's not. Izuku stopped flailing his arms once he saw the sarcastic hint of laughter curling the corners of Uraraka's mouth. She was teasing him. He let out a breath and regained his composure. Uraraka's expression softened as he continued. What I'm trying to say is that I've spent most of my life feeling helpless and broken. So when I see people feeling helpless and broken, I can't help seeing myself in them. Like Eri, Uraraka volunteered. Izuku nodded. I know what it feels like to need someone to jump in and be a hero. He raised his right arm and studied the scars running along his hand and wrist. I'm so lucky to have this power to help people. That's why I can't stop myself from jumping in for all the innocent people out there who think they're without hope. I'll give my all. My blood, my sweat, everything. One for all wasn't his only power, Izuku realized. All the hopelessness of being born quirkless, all the frustration of chasing a dream he could never catch, it had bloomed into an ability to push harder and harder as things looked worse and worse. Now he was here, at UA, learning from his idol and surrounded by friends. All that misery was leading somewhere after all. Turning to Uraraka, Izuku was about to ask her what it was like when her quirk first appeared when a face-splitting yawn rumbled up from his throat. Izuku hurried to cover his mouth, but there was no hiding it. I thought you said you weren't too tired to train tonight, Uraraka accused. I'm not. I'm fine. It's not the training. It's. Another yawn forced its way past his lips, prompting a look of accusation from Uraraka. If you need sleep, we can always take a couple days off. There's no reason to kill yourself over this. It's fine. Really. Izuku tried to give Uraraka the most reassuring smile he could. You've helped me out so much since we started school. I want to be there to support you, too. The least I can do is help you train. Was that all it was? His heart was pumping away, shutting his mind out. Don't you have more to say? It prompted. Don't you want to tell her something? Izuku pushed it down. Tell her. Tell her what, exactly? Izuku drew a deep breath. It didn't really calm his racing heart, but it helped. A little. Izuku opened his mouth and said, Besides like spending this time with you. With the stars and us. Dottin, why yeah, it's just really nice. That had felt like quite the thing to say. Crusher know there was heat rising in his face. He risked a glance at Uraraka. Her hair danced in the night breeze. Her cheeks were flushed from their training before, Izuku was sure. She had one of the most serious expressions he had ever seen on her face. That was odd. Uraraka was always smiling, always a little amused by everything. She seemed very focused on the city in the distance. Clearly, she was thinking hard about something. Maybe she hadn't heard him. That's probably for the best, Izuku thought. Tell her more, his heart whispered. No, his brain shot back. Stop it. Uraraka seemed to come to some kind of a conclusion. Swallowing, she had to open her mouth twice before any words came out. She started hesitantly. Deku. The tickle of something wet splashed their faces. The pair froze. They looked up. Was that? It felt like a sprinkle of raindrops splashed down on them. Izuku and Ochako shared a panicked look. A resounding thunderclap echoed through the sky. In a heartbeat, the sprinkle became a drizzle. Before they could start scampering down the roof tiles, it turned into a full-on downpour. Wrapped in Ochako's quirk, they helped each other off the sloping roof, floating back down to the courtyard. The rain was relentless now. They splashed down onto the grassy pitch, which was quickly turning into one big puddle. Over there, Ochako directed, pointing to the edge of the courtyard. She released her quirk and they ran, side by side, pursued by unrelenting raindrops and booming thunder. The overhanging roof didn't offer much protection, but it was all they had. They ducked underneath gratefully. There was barely 2 feet of cover between them and the water cascading off the roof. They stood shoulder to shoulder, pressing their backs to the wall, watching the downpour. They were breathless from the rush of it all. Their shoes and athletic uniforms were soaked. Next time, Izuku began, breathing heavily. Ochako waited with a questioning look. Next time, we check the forecast. He delivered the line with a flimsy smirk. It was terrible, but it forced a snort from Ochako. The pair looked at each other and quickly dissolved into shared laughter. A crash of thunder startled them both. Their brief moment of mirth was replaced by the realization of their own proximity, of wet hair and water droplets running over noses and down cheeks and across freckles. The sound of each other's breathing penetrated the din of rainfall. Izuku and Ochako found themselves briefly lost in each other. They were wrapped in the foreign intimacy of the moment and the radiant light in each other's eyes. Barely a foot apart, there was an unspoken gravitational pull. A desire to draw closer. Another blunt boom from overhead snapped their frayed nerves. Neither Izuku or Ochako could find the courage to look at each other again. Of the two, Ochako found her voice first. Do you have your notebook? Why yeah, I put it in my pocket. Ochako tried to settle her nerves. Don't think about Deku, she told herself. So she focused on the rain. Ambient light from windows in Heights Alliance spilled out into the courtyard and filled the space with a soft glow. The downpour added an undulating flicker to the light as thick raindrops splashed down and water poured off the roof. She'd been caught in downpours like this before, walking back from school when she was younger. She always remembered the smell of it. Ochako took a long breath in. There was a name for this, the earthy smell that accompanied fresh rainfall, but Ochako couldn't remember it. She became fixated on it. What was that word? She sought her memory desperately for it, simply because it took her thoughts off the heat of Izuku standing next to her shoulder. Meanwhile, Izuku's heart and mind were at war, his shaky nerves caught in the tussle. Uraraka was close, so close. He forced himself to listen and relax into the concussive rhythm of the rainfall. Growing up, he'd always looked forward to rainy days. Kachan's quirk got screwy in the weather. The rain always ensured Bakugo would head straight home after school, leaving Izuku unharassed. Calm began slowly enveloping him. Then, huddled shoulder to shoulder, Izuku and Ochako had a mutually startling realization. In unison, their eyes went wide. They didn't dare move, let alone speak. Their hands. They were holding hands. Who had taken whose hand and when, neither of them knew. But there they were, fingers gently entwined between them. They both wondered frantically. Did the other know? Did they realize? How long had they been standing here like this? Both of them were terrified of looking to the other to confirm, of moving, of speaking, of calling attention to it in any way, for fear that the revelation would shatter what thinly sustained courage was allowing them to keep their hand wrapped in the other's. Thunder echoed somewhere in the distance. Neither Izuku or Ochako heard it over the sound of their own massive heartbeats. Just as Izuku began rallying himself to pull back and apologize, surely it was his fault, he felt something. Ochako gave his hand an almost imperceptibly light squeeze, like a secret passed between them. Hardly believing what was happening, Izuku responded with a tiny, shaky squeeze of his own. An unspoken acknowledgement passed between them. Yes, they both knew, and yes, they were both very okay with it. Izuku felt lightheaded and resisted the urge to hide his face. Ochako wanted to cry out and throw her hands against her cheeks. This was something new for them. Something unexpected and delicate. They were drowning in this moment, neither of them knowing what exactly this meant but both unable to muster up the courage to ask. The relentless beating of rainfall continued. Soft light spilled into the courtyard through the window. Ochako and Izuku stayed under their tiny bit of cover, basking in the warmth of their entwined hands. Subtly, the rain began to slow down. In just a few short minutes the downpour would wane until it was just a drizzle, and the pair would lose any excuse to stay as they were. They both silently wished for the rain to hold out. Just for a little longer. To preserve this fragile moment. Here, right now, was a moment they both wanted to hang on to, for just a few seconds more. Where stories live. Discover now.